The 1990s Australian car market made a lot of promises to family buyers. 10 of the purchases that didn't keep them, counting from 10 to 1. The one at the very top carried a name Australian families had trusted through 4 decades, and arrived in 1997 with a dashboard that cracked in the summer heat and a shape that divided the country from the first day it appeared. That one is still ahead. Number 10. Proton Persona, 1996 to 2000. The Persona's pitch to Australian family buyers was straightforward. Mitsubishi-derived engineering at a price point no equivalent Japanese car could approach. The connection to Mitsubishi was real. The architecture came from an earlier Lancer generation, which gave buyers a legitimate reason to take the specifications seriously. The gap between that inherited platform and the build quality Proton applied around it became apparent in ownership. Body corrosion arrived ahead of what buyers had any reason to expect from a car sold on its value credentials, and the gap between the showroom premise and the driveway experience was wide enough that Proton's footprint in Australia contracted steadily through the decade. The buyers who got in early carried the full weight of that discovery. The next car had more brand history behind it, and still found a way to waste a significant portion of it. Number 9. Rover 600. 1996 to 1999. Here is the detail that makes the Rover 600 story specifically pointed. The engineering underneath it was the 5th generation Honda Accord. Honda supplied the platform, the structure, the layout, the mechanical fundamentals, and Rover built their own body, interior, and components around it. The Honda foundation was sound. The Rover-specific execution introduced the problems: electrical concerns, interior trim quality, and reliability patterns in the components Rover had added to the Honda base gave owners of a car priced as a European premium alternative an experience that the Honda underpinnings hadn't invited. A buyer who chose the 600 over an equivalent Accord was paying more for the Rover identity and receiving less reliability in return. The engineering argument ran directly against the purchasing argument, and the buyers who discovered that were rarely in a position to reverse the decision comfortably. The next car had no premium pretense to complicate the picture, just a straightforward failure at a budget price. Number 8. Daewoo Cielo, 1995 to 1997. When a brand enters a new market, the first product defines the relationship before anything else is available to correct it. Daewoo chose the Cielo as that introduction, a 1.5-liter 4-cylinder built on the Opel Kadett E platform, which had already been superseded before Australian deliveries began. In a segment where the Corolla and the Laser were demonstrating what 1994 compact car engineering looked like, the Cielo's combination of outdated architecture and build quality that buyers found wanting gave Daewoo a starting reputation the price advantage couldn't fully compensate for. The motoring press was direct. The buyers who discovered the same thing through ownership had shorter conversations about it, but reached the same conclusion. Daewoo improved the products that followed the Cielo in Australia. The Cielo had already set the terms of the introduction, and those terms were difficult to renegotiate from that position. The next car had been in Australia long enough to know better. Number 7. Hyundai Excel X3, 1994 to 2000. Hyundai had been selling in Australia since the mid-1980s, which meant that by the time the X3 arrived, there was an established buyer relationship to draw on and an established set of expectations attached to it. The X3 came with a 1.5-liter 4-cylinder and a price that placed it at the accessible end of the compact segment, which was where Hyundai lived and where its buyers were looking. The corrosion that appeared in early Australian ownership was not the kind of problem a budget-priced car at that position in the market could absorb without consequence. Rust in the first few years of ownership travels as a story faster than any advertisement, and the X3's reliability record across the broader Australian fleet added enough to that story to make the comparison with the Japanese alternatives very easy to draw and very difficult to win. Hyundai closed the quality gap seriously and permanently in the years that followed. That process was made harder than it needed to be by the X3. The next car had no brand history to damage, but found a way to do it anyway. Number 6. Kia Mentor, 1996 to 2000. Kia's strategy for Australia in the mid-1990s was the same one every second-tier manufacturer attempts at entry. Price below the established players, accept the credibility gap, and build from there. The Mentor used a 1.5-liter engine on a platform shared with the Mazda 323, which gave it reasonable underpinnings and priced it where a careful buyer with a limited budget would find it. The build quality Kia applied to those foundations is where the calculation broke down. Buyers who compared the Mentor directly with the 323 found the gap significant and not in Kia's favor, and that comparison was straightforward to make because the platform origins were no secret. The brand that Kia became, with quality and reliability that now competes at a different level entirely, bears very little resemblance to what the Mentor communicated about it in 1996. That transformation is genuinely impressive. The distance traveled makes the starting point look harder in retrospect than it felt at the time. The next car had considerably more engineering ambition and delivered a more specific kind of disappointment. We are halfway through. From here, the cars on this list had more invested in them, higher prices, more specific promises, and harder landings when the gap between the promise and the product became apparent. The one at number 1 had more than 40 years of Australian family trust behind it. That one is still coming. Number 5. Chrysler Neon, 1996 to 1999. The Neon arrived in Australia with a 2.0-litre four-cylinder and positioning that asked buyers to take Chrysler seriously in the compact family segment. Not an unreasonable request, given the brand's history, but an ambitious one, given what the Japanese manufacturers had been building in that space for 20 years. The engine's head gasket failures across Australian Neon ownership were documented in a pattern consistent enough to describe a systemic problem rather than isolated misfortune. An engine failure in a compact family car bought specifically for its economy and reliability is not a minor inconvenience. It is a fundamental breach of the transaction the buyer believed they were completing. The buyers who experienced it in 1996 or 1997 formed opinions that no subsequent Chrysler product was going to shift quickly. The next car's failure was more visible, more structural, and harder to explain away. Number 4. Ford Falcon AU, 1998 to 2002. Built at Broadmeadows in Victoria, the Falcon had been part of Australian family life since 1960, a name that had worked its way into the driveways, the road trips, and the household budgets of the country, with a consistency nothing else in the Australian market had matched across the same period. The AU was presented as the most significant Falcon redesign in years. What it delivered was a front-end design that generated immediate and sustained public commentary, and a dashboard that cracked in the Australian heat across enough cars in enough postcodes to become one of the decade's defining quality stories. Sales fell significantly from the outgoing EL Falcon. Ford responded with the BA in 2002, and the brand recovered. But the 4 years the AU spent in the market were years in which buyers who had returned to Ford across multiple previous Falcon generations found themselves explaining a decision they hadn't anticipated needing to defend. The one at number 1 had even more accumulated trust to spend, and spent it on a more complete set of ownership problems. Number 3. Mitsubishi Magna TS, 1993 to 1996. The Magna was built at Tunsley Park in Adelaide, the facility that carried the lineage of Chrysler Australia's production history, and the TS series placed a 3.0-litre V6, the 6G72, in a family car competing directly with the Commodore and Falcon at accessible pricing. The 6G72 is an interference engine, which means that when the timing belt fails, the pistons reach the space the valves occupy, and the engine is destroyed in a single moment at whatever speed the car was traveling. Mitsubishi published a replacement schedule for the belt, and owners who followed it had no problem. The owners who bought the car second-hand without complete service records, or who stretched the interval further than the schedule allowed, found out what interference meant at the worst possible moment. There is no warning, no gradual deterioration to indicate what is about to occur, just the engine stopping and the assessment that follows. A family car that looks from the outside identical to any other competent sedan of the period, carrying a consequence inside the engine bay that the used car price did not include a clear disclosure about. The next entry on this list carries the decade's most public failure, a name, a shape, and a dashboard that cracked before the second summer was finished. Number 2. Holden Camira JE, 1987 to 1989. The Camira's presence on this list is specific to its final generation. By the JE series, Holden had been working through the warranty claims and the ownership complaints that the JB and JD had generated since 1982. Revisions had been made. The problems that had followed the car's launch were understood at Holden's Elizabeth plant in South Australia and were being addressed. But the reputation that had traveled through dealer service departments and across suburban driveways across 3 years of JD production had arrived at a conclusion, and that conclusion wasn't waiting for the JE's improvements to present their case. A buyer choosing a Camira in 1987 or 1988 was doing so in a market where the ownership experience of the cars that preceded the current model was the primary source of advice available to them. The JE was a better car than the JD in specific and measurable ways. The conversation about the Camira had moved past the specification. The family that chose one in 1988 was making a decision the neighbors hadn't recommended, and some of them found out across the following years that the recommendation they'd received was the more accurate one. The car at number 1 had a cleaner engineering record and a more dramatic public failure. Number 1. Holden Commodore VT, 1997 to 2000. The VT Commodore was Holden's largest single investment in the decade. Built at Elizabeth in South Australia, the new platform, a 3.8-litre V6 as the volume engine with a 5.0-litre V8 option, rack and pinion steering replacing the recirculating ball system the VS had used, and a cabin presented as a substantive step forward in quality and refinement. The launch was the most significant Holden event of the decade. The problems that arrived in early production were proportional to the scale of the announcement that had preceded them. Automatic transmission failures, specifically in the 4L60E unit, appeared in a pattern across the early VT fleet, consistent enough to generate Holden dealer attention well beyond isolated cases. The interior quality that the launch had emphasized as a defining improvement showed trim concerns in real-world ownership that the presentation hadn't invited. These were not the kinds of problems buyers expected from the car Holden had described as its most thoroughly engineered product in years, and they were not the kinds of problems the Holden name, 40 years of it, had trained those buyers to anticipate. The VT was also the year Holden retired the Commodore's previous dashboard architecture and introduced a new interior environment. That interior, in the summer heat of an Australian driveway, gave early owners an experience the Holden name had not prepared them for. The gap between what the VT announced about itself and what a proportion of its earliest buyers found in their first 2 years of ownership is the decade's most complete version of a story this list has been building towards. A trusted name, a major investment, a genuine attempt to advance the product, and a production quality gap that arrived in driveways before the reputation had time to manage it. The neighbors noticed, the service departments noticed, and the buyers who were there at the beginning carry a specific and detailed memory of the specific and detailed ways the most important Holden of the decade didn't quite close the distance between its launch day and its first service interval. These 10 were bought by families making reasonable choices with the information available, a brand name earned across previous generations, a price that made the case, a test drive that showed nothing wrong. The problems arrived later, in service schedules, in summer heat, in the kind of quiet engineering failure that becomes a permanent part of how a household thinks about the next decision. Some of the manufacturers recovered, all of the buyers remember. Which of these ended up in your family's driveway, and what did the first 12 months actually teach you? Tell me in the comments. I read every one. And if Australian motoring history is what brought you here, a like and a subscribe to Sunburnt Chrome keeps it coming.